story about how my mother demands to give up my father's apartment to his sister because I am alone and she has 3 children, and with her they are close. Family dynamics can be a little tricky, but when your mother demands your apartment, it stops being tricky and starts being absolutely absurd. That's the situation I've found myself in, thanks to the brilliant logic of my mother, who seems to think I owe her and my stepfather my entire life, quite literally, my apartment. And not just any apartment, the one my father left me after he passed away. Let me introduce you to the key players. My mother, Christine, is the driving force behind this family drama. She's married to my stepfather, Greg, who came into my life when I was 6. I didn't think much of Greg at first, just a slightly boring man who liked to read the newspaper for hours on end while the rest of us tiptoed around him. That was before he started blaming me for every little thing that went wrong around the house, like the time the dishwasher broke and he somehow convinced everyone it was my fault because I wasn't careful enough with the dishes. I was 6. What kind of elaborate dish-breaking sabotage does a 6-year-old mastermind? Then there's my younger sister Rachel. She was born when I was 8 and immediately became the golden child, the apple of my mother's eye. You know the type. Teachers at school loved her. She always had the perfect braid in her hair, and worst of all, she was sneaky. Oh, she knew exactly how to cause chaos and make it look like it was my fault. Once, she managed to scribble all over the walls in the living room with a marker, but somehow I was the one who got in trouble because I should have been watching her. I was 10, a child watching a child, genius parenting. Fast forward to now, and you have a 30-year-old me living peacefully in an apartment my dad left me after he passed away, and Rachel, now 25, married with 3 kids. That's right, 3. And guess where they all live? Yep, crammed into my mother's and stepfather's 2-bedroom house like sardines in a can. Rachel, her husband Tom, and their 3 kids, plus Christine and Greg. As you can imagine, it's a recipe for disaster. But instead of finding a solution that makes sense, my mother has decided that I need to give up my apartment and move back in with her. Why? So Rachel and her chaotic brood can have more space. Her reasoning: it's for the family. It started innocently enough, as most absurd family demands do. My mother called me one evening after I'd just gotten home from work, and I could tell something was up from the moment she said, "We need to talk." Now, I don't know about you, but "we need to talk" from my mother never meant anything good. I braced myself. "Your sister's expecting another baby," she said, her voice laced with the false sweetness she used when she was about to ask for something huge. "Oh," I replied flatly, not sure what she was getting at. "Well, that's nice." There was a pause, and I could feel the awkward tension through the phone. "They're running out of space over here," she continued. "There's only so much room in this house, and with Tom, Rachel, and the kids, it's becoming impossible. They're cramped." I stayed silent, waiting for the punchline. "So I was thinking," she went on, her tone turning more businesslike, "maybe it's time for you to help out the family." I sighed, knowing exactly where this was headed. "Mum, what do you mean?" "Well," she said, with the air of someone about to deliver a great solution to a global crisis, "you're single. You don't need that big apartment all to yourself. You could move back here with us and Rachel and the kids could have your place. It makes perfect sense." Perfect sense. In what universe did that make perfect sense? I paused, struggling to come up with a response that wasn't just screaming into the phone. "Mum, no, that's not happening," I said firmly. "The apartment was Dad's. He left it to me. It's mine. Rachel and Tom can figure something else out." "But they don't have the means to buy a new place," she protested, her voice rising with frustration. "And you've got everything you need. You're just being selfish." Selfish. There it was. The ultimate card every manipulative parent plays when they don't get what they want. You have to understand something about Rachel. Ever since we were kids, Rachel was the queen of manipulation. She'd gotten away with everything, from eating all the cookies and blaming me to lying about me accidentally breaking things around the house. But the worst part, my mother bought into it every single time. Now, as an adult, Rachel was no different. She had her husband, Tom, who was a nice enough guy but a bit clueless, and 3 kids who seemed to follow in their mother's footsteps when it came to causing chaos. They all lived together at my mother's house, and if you thought my stepfather had a problem with me as a kid, you should see him now. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 5, constantly frazzled and worn out from the noise and mess that Rachel's kids caused. So when my mother started suggesting that I move back home so Rachel and her family could live in my apartment, I knew exactly where this idea had come from: Rachel herself. It wasn't enough for her to take over my childhood home. Now she wanted to take over the apartment my dad had left me. And the worst part, my mother was fully on board with it. At first, I tried to brush off her request, thinking it would go away, but it didn't. Every few days, I'd get another phone call, another guilt trip. My mother would send me pictures of Rachel's kids, pictures of them crammed into a tiny bedroom, looking pitiful. It was like she was trying to use the children as a weapon of emotional warfare. "Look how they're living," she'd say. "Don't you want to help your family?" The answer was no. No, I didn't want to give up my apartment, and no, I didn't feel guilty about it. Rachel made her choices. I wasn't going to pay for them. One day, things came to a head. I received yet another call from my mother, this time with my stepfather, Greg, joining in on the conversation. Now, Greg and I had never gotten along. He'd always been critical of me, finding fault with everything I did, even when I was a child. So the fact that he was on the call meant only one thing: my mother was getting desperate. "Listen," Greg began, his voice as gruff as ever. "We've put up with a lot from you over the years." I almost laughed. They put up with me. I was the one who had to endure years of being blamed for everything that went wrong in that house. "But it's time for you to step up and do the right thing," he continued. "Your sister and her family need that apartment more than you do. You don't even have kids. What do you need 3 bedrooms for?" "Excuse me," I replied, my blood boiling. "This isn't about need. It's about the fact that the apartment is mine. I'm not giving it up just because you think Rachel deserves it more." "You're being unreasonable," Greg huffed. "You've always been difficult." "Maybe I've been difficult because you've always treated me like an outsider," I snapped back. "This isn't about Rachel needing space. This is about you all thinking you can push me around like you've always done." There was a brief, awkward silence. I could hear my mother whispering something to Greg in the background, but I couldn't make it out. "Look," I said, taking a deep breath, "I'm sorry things are cramped over there, but it's not my responsibility to fix it. Rachel and Tom are adults. They can figure it out, but my apartment stays mine." My mother sighed dramatically. "I just don't understand why you're being so selfish. We raised you, didn't we? We took care of you when your father left. Now it's your turn to take care of us." That was the final straw. It wasn't long before I started hearing rumors. Apparently, Rachel and my mother had been telling people in their circle, family, friends, neighbors, that I was holding the apartment hostage. That I was some kind of cold-hearted, greedy person who refused to help out her own family. Of course, they left out the part where the apartment had been left to me by my dad, or the part where they had essentially treated me like the family servant growing up. One of my cousins, Jane, even reached out to me. "Hey, I've been hearing some things. Are you really refusing to let your sister's family live in your apartment? That seems kind of harsh." I was floored. Rachel had weaponized the family gossip network to try and guilt me into giving up my home. But Jane, to her credit, was open to hearing my side of the story. "No," I told her, "they're trying to manipulate me. That apartment is mine. It was Dad's, and he left it to me. Rachel and her family don't need my apartment. They just want it." To my surprise, Jane nodded. "Yeah, that sounds more like it. I figured there was more to the story." But not everyone was as understanding. My Aunt Lisa sent me a scathing text message, accusing me of being ungrateful and selfish. Apparently, in her mind, I owed it to my mother to give up the apartment because family comes first. It all came to a head one Saturday afternoon when my mother and Rachel showed up at my apartment unannounced. I had just settled in for a quiet day of reading when the doorbell rang, and there they were. My mother with her classic "I'm disappointed in you" face, and Rachel looking smug, as if she was about to win some grand prize. "We need to talk," my mother said, pushing past me into the living room. Rachel followed, and I knew this was going to be a disaster. "We've given you enough time to think this over," my mother began, as if she was giving me a generous offer. "But we need an answer now. Are you going to let Rachel and her family move in or not?" I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorway. "I've already told you. The answer is no." Rachel, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "You don't even need this apartment. You're single, you have no kids, and you're living in this huge place all by yourself. It's ridiculous." "And you made your choices," I shot back. "You decided to have kids. You decided to stay at Mum's house. That's not my problem." My mother's face was turning red, and I could see the frustration boiling over. "I don't understand why you're being so stubborn about this. We're family." "That's funny," I said, my voice cold. "Because you didn't seem to care about family when you treated me like an afterthought for most of my life. You never took my side. You let Greg walk all over me, and now you expect me to just hand over my apartment. That's not happening." The room fell silent. For the first time, Rachel didn't have a smug look on her face. My mother looked like she was about to explode. "If you don't help us, we'll never speak to you again," my mother finally said, her voice shaking with anger. I shrugged. "That's your choice, but the answer is still no." A few weeks later, I got a call from my cousin Jane, who had some interesting news. Apparently, Rachel and Tom had found a solution to their cramped living situation, one that didn't involve taking my apartment. Tom's parents had offered to help them out by renting them a house in the suburbs. It wasn't the city apartment Rachel had dreamed of, but it was spacious enough for their growing family. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. After all the drama, the emotional manipulation, and the guilt trips, they had found another option. And just like that, my mother's grand plan had fallen apart. With Rachel and her family settled in their new home, my life finally returned to normal. My mother had gone radio silent, clearly still upset that she hadn't gotten her way. But honestly, it was a relief. I didn't miss the constant calls or the guilt trips. For the first time in years, I felt free. As for me, I kept my apartment, my sanity, and my peace of mind. I realized that standing up for myself, even against family, was one of the most important things I could do. And the best part, I didn't feel guilty at all. There you go. The story has been expanded with new characters, humor, and a fitting twist. Let me know if you'd like to make any further adjustments.